Nothing in the story I am about to tell is going to be supernatural or unexplainable. There is no great mystery to glean out of my telling. There won't be any surprises or revelations made here. I am merely making my way through the fog of amnesia. I am, literally speaking, retracing the steps I had lost many years ago. I am writing this to the cold auditory landscape of Monty Eyes in the Depths of Darkness album. If any of this comes out as more depressive, or colder than it should, I apologize in advance. For me, this process is a way to get rid of the intrusive thoughts that keep up at night. Strange mental pictures sneaking up on me in the quiet hours of the day from within the boundless darkness of the night. Bizarre images of the dead and the dying circling me in their uninterrupted, eternal rest. This specific battle with unreasonable fears and anxiety started after a funeral. One of many such battles with an incurable enemy, but I'll get to that later. My longtime friend, George. He passed away from cancer recently. It ate at him like a starved animal. He was gone almost in an instant. Between the time he told me about his diagnosis and his passing, 5 months had passed. In that time frame, life had bled from out of his body. 5 months is what it took for the malignancy to reduce him from a giant of a man to a mummified husk, barely able to keep his massive skeletal frame upright. George could have been a strongman if he wanted to. He certainly had the size for it. He was a gentle giant, though. The last time we spoke, he asked me if I remember the films we used to make together as kids. I remembered something about it. Didn't remember the details at all, however. He told me all about it, bringing back a flood of pleasant memories. When I was a kid, I wanted to get into cinematography. A bunch of friends of mine and I did. We all aspired to be a filmmaking crew together, so during our days in middle school in the early aughts, we made a bunch of short films and sketches. None of it panned out, as I'm sure is clear by now. George reminded me of the compact discs I was supposed to have with all these projects of ours. He said he watched a bunch of them recently and that it was a shame we never got to make anything professionally. I scoffed at the idea when we spoke, thinking we must have been incredibly amateurish about our craft. Only after his passing did I find the will and the CDs to revisit this old passion of mine. One I had forgotten I even had. Upon a second viewing of the material, I can proudly say that we were too good for a bunch of teens doing amateur short films. There were a bunch of sketches and movies there, ranging from slapstick comedy with toilet humor to action-style flicks riddled with parkour sequences. There's also a hype video someone made of my swimming. I used to be a competitive swimmer in my youth, that is until an injury forced me out of the sport. Then there was this one film whose title had an aura to it. The Rasp. For a reason I couldn't understand back then, I couldn't get myself to play the video for what seemed like an hour. Something about that thing felt off. Granted, there was nothing off about the film. It took me a moment, but I finally played the file. It took about 15 seconds of the dry, labored breathing we used as the score at the beginning of the video to take me decades back. Pausing the video, I took a moment to soak in my returning memories. The rasp was supposed to be our big break. That's what we saw it as, our so-called big break. The memories came back flooding. This was the first time we treated it like real cinematography. There were a bunch of kids from school and the neighborhood I didn't even know involved in this thing. We had them as extras in the film. We made the whole thing with utmost realism in mind. It seemed as real as we could afford to make it on a non-budget. A 12-minute motion picture exploring the unmatched beauty of human mortality in all of its oppressive glory. I was playing the role of a dead person, along with dozens of other kids. We were all covered in grayish body paint to make ourselves look as close to real corpses as possible. I started remembering how we covered the walls of the building we filmed in with drawings made by the elder sister of one of my friends, Catherine Montserrat. She was one of the few cool adults around. We're still in touch to this day. I remember she used to mix her dye with her blood. I know she's making a living as an artist and an art teacher, but I'm not sure if she's still doing the blood thing. When her brother, Mark, convinced her to work on the creepy art for our project, she ended up showing me her process. You'd never believe someone who is the epitome of sanity would just cut open their hand and then shove a paintbrush into the wound, but that's how she did it. She's the one who introduced all of us into cool adult music too. She kept saying that nu metal and grunge, which were the mainstream heavy music, back then, were boring and for losers. These were simpler times. Anyway, once the euphoria of finding something I couldn't find for so long finally subsided, I pressed play and let my eyes get lost in the gloomy atmosphere of George's camera, slowly exploring a poorly lit concrete structure. The erratic breathing in the background seemed to crawl out of my speakers and into my room, almost engulfing me. He panned the camera onto a series of purposefully poorly drawn images hanging on the wall, some hanging loosely on the wall. As he passed drawing after drawing, a clear picture emerged. It was a tale of great sorrow and pain boiling into pure hatred. It was a story of a strange man and his little dog, much like the artist who drew that man's life. The man was a painter. He kept painting his little four-legged friend over and over. He seemed happy in the first drawings shown. Deeper into the corridor there was a drawing hanging of the two walking down the street, the backdrop of the story growing increasingly dark. As George went deeper into the corridor, the drawings turned darker. A group of hooded figures showed up from the darkness, first mocking the man and his dog, then pulling out bats and knives to attack the man. It was horrible, the awful breathing noise, the grimy drawing style. The camera slightly shook as George attempted the emotional weight of the story unfolding before my eyes. A couple of feet deeper and the man is being beaten up. The next drawing has the little animal attempting to defend its owner. In the next, it's struck down. Further, they're both on the floor, beaten and bloodied. The dog ends up gravely injured. It doesn't make it. The following drawing is of the man weeping over his dog, followed by one where he is about to bury his deceased companion. My heart was in shambles watching this, The breathing in the background slowly turned into heaving pounding in my ears as the drawings shifted from a depiction of a physical tragedy to the mental anguish of a man who had lost his everything. If pain and anguish were monsters, Katie's amorphous, shadowy demonic design crawling out of a defeated man's shape would probably be an accurate depiction. When George passed the final drawing on the wall, I could feel the cold air of the recorded space tightening its grip on me. It was a grotesque, misshapen apparition of a man metamorphosed into an abyssal monstrosity. The camera made a sharp turn to face a door with a peeling paint job. It was an old, ancient, even. No one was in that building for years before we got there, I reckon. The heaving in the background has morphed into a throaty clicking noise that won't stop trying to crack my skull open. George's hand pushed the door open. It creaked through the clicking noises, grating against my eardrums, and an imagined scent of dust assaulted my nostrils. I am completely immersed in the film. The silhouettes of people lying in neatly arrayed beds were visible from the edge of the room where George was filming. A single light bulb, barely working, hung overhead, swinging softly. It was hardly illuminating anything in that room, producing just enough light to make out the details clearly, while adding to the sinister feeling of the film. With slow and deliberate steps, he entered the room. My heart began racing as my mind was expecting some kind of catch. A jump scare, a loud shriek bouncing against the walls, something. Logic and experience told me something had to happen, but my memory wasn't complete yet to tell me what was supposed to happen. George approached the first bed, capturing a human silhouette covered with sheets. Cautiously placing his hand on the sheet, he slowly pulled it down, and I turned anxious watching him do that. I was expecting something, bloody, rats, a roar, a real monster lurking beneath the sheet, a head rolling onto the floor to scare the life out of the camera-carrying boy. Instead, all I got is another kid, pale and motionless, his eyes closed, imitating death. The revelation didn't put me at ease. Instead, my anxiety kept getting worse with each passing second I was viewing the film. George continued walking around the room, approaching every bed, removing each sheet, and allowing me to stare at the faux corpse beneath. Some of whom are familiar, while others are strangers. And as that process unfolded, I kept thinking something's got to happen. Something had to happen. Something would happen. Someone would bite him with force. Someone wouldn't wake up after the camera stops rolling. There would be a real dead body under one sheet. A knife-swinging man was going to emerge from the darkness. Nothing happened. It was a mock corpse after a mock corpse after a mock corpse. I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was wrong. My appearance in the film didn't make me feel any better. It made my dread worse. By the time George had reached the bed I was lying in, I completely forgot I was one of those corpses, too. When he finally pulled the sheet from my past self's head, we both screamed at what awaited beneath. Me and Film George. A dead, empty stare. My dead, empty stare. I wore contact lenses to make it seem as if the fog of the moribund had completely veiled my open eyes. A perverted version of my past yet simultaneously future self stared at me from the screen. There was something disturbingly uncanny in the corpse me, and while the movie continued with George continuing his documentation of the mock corpses, I couldn't keep watching the film. The visual of my mortality remained burned into my retinas, and for a few heart-wrenching moments, I saw it everywhere I turned my gaze. A sudden feeling that I can only describe as a fire alarm without sound going off in my head forced me to pause the video. The floodgates of my subconsciousness broke down, allowing lost memories to resurface. Perhaps it wasn't the loss of memory as much as it was the suppression of unpleasant memories. Staring at a poorly lit silhouette on a bed on my screen, I remember how a week after we finished working on this thing, Seth, an older friend of ours who already had a driver's license, was driving us home after classes. Chris, George, and someone flew from the opposite direction into our lane, slamming headfirst into us. I found all of this in hindsight. My head and neck got messed up, the impact scrambled my brain, and I had lost recollection of a long time frame. George ended up hospitalized too. He had a bunch of broken ribs and a ruptured lung, and Chris never made it. Seth was virtually unharmed, barring a few scratches and bruises from the windshield shattering on top of him. I sat there, staring at the screen. Film George was about to approach Chris. My insides twisted in knots and my head turned unbearably heavy. I felt sick with my vision shifting between the frozen picture on the screen and the memory of that day. The screeching of wheels and a brief flash of burning pain coursing along my body before everything vanished. I felt ill, as if my body had developed a fever. Shaking, I turned the video off. There's no way I'm going to watch that thing ever again. I don't know what else I had forgotten, but I don't even want to know at this point. I was so shaken by the sudden recollection that I ended up getting sick. It's been a while since I've watched The Rasp, but the images from the film are still lingering in my mind. I haven't slept right since because of a relapsing insomnia. The visual of this morgue containing my childhood friends and acquaintances is trapping me inside my mind. It's as if something inside of me wants to see the film's ending. My mental innards cling to the hope that there's some catharsis at the end of it all, but there is none. I know how it ends. There is nothing there. Only different shades of death. A painful memory of an inevitable future. I ended up talking to Katie about the film. She said she remembers working on it fondly. She still has the original paintings somewhere in her collection. Out of morbid curiosity, I asked her how the film ends. She said that George uncovers all the bodies in the building, and leaves the same way he came. However, instead of panning his camera on the right wall of the corridor, he pans it on the left one, revealing a continuation of her story. In these drawings, the man has finally lost his sanity to hatred. He plans on killing those who killed his dog but always ends up finding them dead, murdered brutally. This continues, along with his spiral further into madness. Katie depicted his loss of humanity with purposefully inhumanly shaped screams and grimaces. The story reaches its climax when he finally reaches the last person he set out to kill, but he ends up finding out what had killed them all. A vile dog monster that mauls its last victim in front of its eyes. The beast reveals itself to be the man's old dog, turned into a vengeful spirit. There's a rather heartwarming drawing of the beast wagging its tail at the sight of its previous owner. This is where Katie's grim brilliance shines brightest. With the last 5 drawings, she snatches all hope away from the observer. The man doesn't recognize the beast as his old friend and ends up running away in fear. In the penultimate drawing shown in the film, the man is dying in a pool of his blood, after being run over in incoming traffic. The beast looks on dejected at its dying master as its form slowly disintegrates in the last picture of the film and the screen turns black. Katie sent me scans of the drawings and hell, it looks far worse than it sounds. Features lose cohesion as the story progresses. Katie probably used a lot of blood to draw the final few scenes of that story. She made the last few drawings entirely rusty red. I started feeling better again. Until today, when I received the news that Seth ended his life. He had never been the same after the accident, he became depressed and withdrawn. Even though it wasn't his fault, he still blamed himself for Chris's death and George's and mine's injuries. We drifted apart after the fact, but I never blamed him for any of this. Neither did George. As far as I know, the Moores, Chris's family, never blamed him either. As I was reading the text message about Seth's death, the demons in my head twisted Katie's voice into a low, hoarse drawl echoing against the wall of my skull. Seth Novak, remember him? He played the final dead guy in The Rasp. I gave him a nasty makeup contusion around the neck for his part in the film. Boomed in the back of my mind. Jesus Christ. Seth hanged himself.